Hey, welcome back to Lick of the Week videos. We've been looking at a beginner series of videos specifically at ideas for the left hands, things that we are familiar with in bluegrass that I refer to as ornaments. Slides and hammer-ons were a couple of ornaments for the left hand that we looked at in the first few videos. The last video dealt with push-offs and pull-offs. This video I'd like to take a look at another commonly occurring left hand ornament or left hand technique that you'll use in your playing for bluegrass banjo is called a choke. And a choke is the same thing that a guitar player, say in blues music, would refer to as a bend or a bent note. If you listen to any rock and roll guitar or any blues guitar, then you're familiar with the sound of a bend. So we have a different name for this, basically the same technique. A choke is a bluegrass reference for a bend in a guitar world. Now, where would you do a bend and what finger would you use to do bends? Well, you can use any finger of the left hand. You can choke any string on any fret, any location. It's up to you. But let's look at a couple of commonly occurring places, especially if you're a beginner and you're new to the concept of a choke. Let's look at what the choke is, how to do it cleanly, and some common places to hear chokes. Now, probably the most common place that you hear chokes on the banjo, especially if you're a beginner, is the 10th fret of the second string. Now, before we do that choke, I want to zoom in with the camera like we've been doing on each video, and I'd like to get a good close shot of the 10th fret of the second string. Now, I'm going to use the middle finger for this particular choke. Now, could you use the index finger? Yes. Could you use the ring? Yes. Could you even choke a string with the pinky? Yes. How do you decide which finger to use? Well, that depends on where you're going next, what type of position you're going to be holding, and the flow of the notes for the right hand. So there really is no rule to say that you have to use this finger or that finger. You use what works the best at that given time to play what it is you're trying to play. Now, I'm going to use my middle finger, and I'm going to play the second string with the index finger of my right hand. You can use the thumb, doesn't really matter. And to get a good sounding choke, the first thing you have to determine is how far do I want to choke this string. You can choke it as far as you physically can do it, but you have to remember that how far you make a bend or a choke will change the tone of that string. It could be a quarter note bend, or a quarter of the distance between this note and the next note above it. It could be a half step bend. Instead of a quarter note, I'm going to do a half step, which gives me the same note as the note on the same string above it. So listen to this choke note. Now listen to the same string one fret higher. And I could even go way past this. I could do a whole step choke. But usually when you hear chokes in the combination of bluegrass roll patterns and these songs that we're familiar with, most of the chokes wind up being no more than a half step choke. And sometimes they're just quarter note, I keep saying quarter note, quarter step chokes, which means you're not quite going up to the next note, but somewhere that sounds in between the two. Now, to get a good sounding choke, you have to keep pretty good pressure with the fretting finger, and you have to push through and across the string, almost like you're digging a channel in the fingerboard, like a little miniature shovel. I mean, I don't want to sound like you're actually going to try to dig a hole in your fingerboard, because you're not, but you need to keep pretty good pressure on the choke, especially up the neck. Seems to be a little harder to do chokes up the neck because of the string height, and it takes a little extra effort to do this. But I'm going to play a common choke on the 10th fret in a roll pattern. Now that's, a choke such as in Foggy Mountain Breakdown and a bunch of common Scruggs solos. You'll hear that type of choke with that roll pattern. But you can play any kind of roll. You can play that choke as an individual note. Now you can also do a bend and release, or a choke and release, where you play a note, choke it, and then play it on the way back down. But let's just worry about the choke itself first. Maybe sometime we'll come back and talk about bend and release. Now, like I said previously, you can play a choke note on any string at any fret location. Use any finger of the right hand to actually pick the string that you're choking. But now we've done the 10th fret, 2nd string. Here's another common location for a choke note, which is the 2nd fret of the 3rd string. And you'll feel a little more resistance to choke as you approach the nut. The closer you get to the nut on the banjo, the stiffer the string becomes, because you're shortening the length of the string and you're getting really close to the actual slots in the nut. So the string gets pretty stiff there, but the 3rd string is really not a hard string to choke. Now again, you could just choke that by itself, or you could use it in the combination of a roll pattern. Let me get a little close up here. Now sometimes you can combine two techniques. And again, you know, the purpose of a choke, which is a common question. Why would you choke a note, John? Well, you could use it to emphasize a melody note, let's say in a vocal song, where you want the banjo to actually syncopate or slur the note just like you would if you were singing a song. Sometimes vocal songs have kind of slurs in the voice. I'll use an example of a song like "Rollin' in My Sweet Baby's Arms." Rollin', rollin', roll, roll, roll. Sometimes when you sing a word as a vocal line, you tend to play around with the kind of the way you syllabilize the word. Rollin', rollin'. And in blues music, I mean, this is something that goes back, you know, over 100 years. Blues guitar players like to do bends to mimic the blues sounds that you would hear somebody sing. And in jazz, they have a term called scatting, which means that you sing the same notes that you play on the guitar. You can also scat the banjo, which is just what I was doing there. But you notice that the reason I'm doing that choke is to kind of play around with the voicing of the note that I'm playing on the banjo to match what the singer's doing with his or her voice. And it can be bluesy, and it can be just to add a little flavor. And if you're not doing that, then you're just doing a choke just because it sounds good. So you're either trying to render a melody somehow with a choke, which is what all ornaments are for, or you're just trying to spice up something that you're already playing. Now, if I combine a couple of different ornaments, watch what happens. I'm going to do a slight choke from 2 to 3, which means I'm going to push up slightly, and then I'm going to slide. So I'm going to have 2 ornaments happening at the same time, a slide and a choke. And listen to what happens. So by doing chokes in combination with some of the other left hand ornaments and techniques, whatever you like to call it, that we've studied before, you can combine them to get some pretty cool phrasings on the banjo. And again, it's going to be to help you emphasize melody, whether it be a note of an instrumental or a vocal song, or it's going to be just something that you add to what you're playing just to spice up what you're doing. So getting a little short on time here, so again, try to use different fingers depending on what you're trying to do. Try to think ahead where you're going to play next, what position you're playing out of. And remember, you can choke any string at any fret with any finger. So just play around with the chokes and see what you can do with them. And we'll see you next video. Thanks.